extremely warm welcome to everybody, and it's a good afternoon Solihull moment, and you are all very, very welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. And I've been very fortunate enough to know Andy for a number of years now, and indeed it was one of my first events as president that I was. We did Professional Services Week, and we had an event at the offices of the Prime Group, and as a result, it's quite fitting that one of my last events as president has Andy here, because over the period of time, whether it be skills and education, whether it be diversity, inclusion, or the well-being in the workplace, perhaps business development, or indeed anything that promotes Solihull, Andy has supported us 100%. And for that, I am very grateful. And I know everybody at Solihull Chamber is particularly grateful. So warm thank you for that, Andy. Ladies and gentlemen, just a little bit of housekeeping. Anything technical that happens to go wrong, please put it in the chat, and then Grace will be able to try and sort that out for you. If you have questions, there's actually a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and you'll be able to put your questions in there. And then when Andy's finished speaking, Tony is going to run that Q&A session before we finish the session this afternoon. So we have a roadmap, and we've had the budget. And now we have the opportunity to spend some very valuable time with Andy Street. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed, Robert. That's a lovely introduction. So I'm going to say right at the beginning, I'm very grateful to Grace because she's going to drive the slides. I'm going to be a human clicker and say when, and the slides will come up and we will talk through these. But hopefully they won't take very long, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. And I've headed it up, as you can see, Solihull and the West Midlands recovery. And if we click on again, I'm going to break it down into three things. Just the story of what was going on before. Now, the reason for doing that is not to be indulgent, but actually to think, what are the lessons of this that we can actually carry forward into our revival? Then I shall be horribly honest about the impact of COVID-19 on what's going on. And then we will talk about the plan for recovery. So that's the framework. Let's get going. Next slide. And this one is nice and simple, and it just basically says up to December 2019, it looked at almost any measure, things were going well for the West Midlands. Almost an unbroken line for total employment, and we'd actually achieved a record high employment level, 75%, even higher in Solihull. And we saw lots of other stats move in the right way. Total growth of our economy faster than anywhere else. We'd actually seen wages rising above the national average. All sorts of stats were going the right way. And people were talking about the 2020s will be a sort of golden decade for the West Midlands. And some of the things that made up that confidence, if we look on to the next slide. Next slide. Yep. We were improving the skill level of our population. This was really important because I'm a huge believer that this ultimately drives the performance of an economy. And back in 2006, 2007, at the previous crash, we'd been the worst skilled level in the whole country. And you can see we were steadily improving. So that was helping us. And click on again. And we'd actually seen another determinant of our economic success, our housing numbers, building homes doubling since 2012. So we weren't building on Greenbelt, by the way, before anyone jumps onto me and says, you shouldn't be doing that. We're not. We were defending Greenbelt. A big increase in the previous year, 16%, but a doubling over just 6 years. So another really good signal. And onward. Another slide. And as I say, a lot of it was on brownfield development. And we'd secured this 400 million from the government to subsidise the reclamation of brownfield sites, such as this one, which uses this sort of modern methods of construction, this modular construction at Port Loop in Ladywood in Birmingham. So we got real momentum in our housing numbers, and that certainly was driving the economy. And then on again. We were also busy investing in our transport network. Right-hand side, the metro that was opened outside Town Hall, and that's the East Side Metro down in Digbeth, where we just started the works after last year's budget gave us £160 million for that particular metro. So we'd got momentum in housing, transport, skills, the things that were really driving the economy. And just one or two more examples of this. Click again. You saw us building new railway stations in central Coventry, in central Wolverhampton. That image of Wolverhampton's about 18 months old now. It's well on the way now. And click again. And just before COVID struck, we of course had the incredible day when the Prime Minister came to the site of the Curzon Street station and said we would be building HS2. And we know that the Solihull economy was to benefit enormously from HS2 and the works around Arden Cross that we will come back to. So just click on again. Huge investment, as I say, at Arden Cross around the HS2 station, and a critical really point to draw out that if we concentrated housing and development there, that helped protect the green belt around lots of Solihull's villages. So I know there's an enormous debate about what's happening at interchange there, but my goodness, there's an upside in all of the village sites that were protected through meeting Solihull's housing numbers right there. So we were feeling very, very confident about our position pre-pandemic. Just one or two more pieces of Solihull transport investment. The sprint route out to Solihull along the Coventry Road. That now the diggers are in the ground for doing that. That was there. And one last one. And of course, one last image. And our local transport obviously being invested in with the local company there providing our rural and suburban bus services, Elmdon-based company there. And then one other aspect of testing and investment in Solihull, we were getting on with what was the country's biggest autonomous vehicle testing facility. That picture on the left is actually in Coventry, but you see the route of the test routes there, M42, A45 through Solihull as well. So we were confident of that as well. And the evidence that all this was working, if we go on one more, young Londoners were voting with their feet. Numbers up to the summer of 2019 were showing that overwhelmingly young Londoners were moving out to the West Midlands, and Birmingham actually had a net migration figure with London for that year. So all this historical talk about the brain drain out of the West Midlands to London, you can see from the slide there that we've got a lot of people moving to us on the back of the economic opportunities, the quality of housing, the quality of green space, and we actually had a net figure with London, and we were the only part of the country to have that net figure. So, as I said, one more slide, we were talking at our presentations this time last year of the 2020s being the West Midlands decade. But onward again. I'm afraid we've had a very, very harsh impact of COVID. And really, however I wrap it up, it can't be disguised at all. Looks as though we are emerging as the hardest hit region. So just go on to another slide. This was predicted. This image is back to last April, and it talked about the predictions for each area of the country, and it talks about the West Midlands being the hardest hit. And a stunning number there, GVA fall per day of £245 million. And this is all to do with the mix of the economy that was here. Very high business tourism, think of the conference sector so strong in Solihull, think of the whole sort of manufacturing sector, the impact that had. So some of the things we were very, very good at, as the next image shows, some of the things we were very good at, there we go, manufacturing, conferences, the whole higher education sector as well, things we were good at made us particularly vulnerable because they obviously have had the biggest hits from the pandemic. And it does now look as though that prediction is coming home for us. So from the fastest growing to the worst impact in one short year. Onward again. And what's that done to the numbers? Very simple. 100,000 people more out of work across the region. The actual claimant count, the number of people claiming benefits, has gone up by 95,000. And there's a horrible symmetry to this. In the first 3 years I was mayor, 97,000 more jobs were created across the West Midlands. And now that figure has gone backwards by somewhere around 95 or 100,000. So we've lost all the progress that we made. Click on to the next slide. And of course, the point is that hit has not been equal. Particularly affected young people, females, and of course, those from our disadvantaged communities, where the rates of unemployment were already relatively high, and they have been the worst impacted. So it's been a very unfair virus in every sense. And let's have a particular look, some of the things we know about. Tough times, for our town centres. That's been part of it, not disproportionate in the West Midlands, interestingly, just as bad in London as the image shows. But we all know our own town centres have taken a very serious beating as well. But there is room for optimism. Let's have a little look. And that's, of course, that the number of people jobless, although bad, as I've just said, is not as high as forecast. And it does look as though, and this is what the Chancellor said last Wednesday, as though the measures that we've taken means that that peak that was expected, the dark blue, looks as though it will be contained. Still, though, as the graph shows there, still a little rise in unemployment still to come, but less stark than we had feared, at least. And if we go onto it, of course, we know that soon we will be past the worst of it. 23% of the West Midlands residents have now had at least one vaccination dose. And actually, across the West Midlands, we're doing pretty well compared to the rest of the country in administering the vaccination. So there is, as you said in your introduction, Robert, hope. And of course, we've now had the first step for lifting the restrictions with schools returning. So if that's the background, the obvious question is what we're going to do about it. What's the plan? So let's have a look. So the plan for recovery. So what we've said is that we need a unique West Midlands plan. And let's have a little look at it. We started off last summer with what we called our Recharge the West Midlands. This was responding to the things that we saw immediately. And we talked about wanting shovel-ready projects to get on with. We talked about repositioning to the future, this whole idea of pivoting. We talked about building on what we were already doing. We talked about things that were uniquely in the West Midlands. And of course, it all had to be about jobs and training. Now, we've had some success in winning funding for the ideas in there. But what we've now done is built on that. Another slide, please. We've built on that with a specific plan around this 100,000 jobs that is required. And I launched this just last Monday. It's a mayoral plan. It's about getting the West Midlands back to work. And it talks about where are those 100,000 jobs going to come from? Not in fantasy world, never, never land, but now. What can we see currently on the stocks, the plans that will give those 100,000 jobs? And I've broken the ideas down into a number of different ideas. So first of all, and we'll just rattle through them quickly, we talked about protecting what we've already got. And a really big issue here is, of course, the support for hospitality. I put the image of the Chancellor because you all will have your own views, but I think he did a pretty reasonable job in stepping forward again with support for the hospitality sector, the grants, the business rates, the VAT exemptions. And the simple point is, if we can revive this sector, we can recover some of the jobs that have already been lost. And the hospitality sector has lost more jobs than any other sector, hence why that is there. Second point, we've got to make the most of the big wins that we have got. And obviously, particularly for Solihull, the big win around HS2 is hugely significant. Already 12,000 people being employed building this line. I think I was told by Ian Court's leader of the council, there are 96 Solihull companies already with contracts for HS2 construction. And of course, we've now seen in the budget another 50 million awarded to do all the initial works to prepare the Arden Cross site there. Still, obviously, the landowners will put all their cash in, but there's lots of work that has to be sort of pump primed, you might call it. And it was brilliant to get that specific funding for Solihull last week in the budget. The other big areas of opportunity on recent wins, of course, City of Culture and Commonwealth Games, 6,000 jobs in the Commonwealth Games. And again, we've got to make sure that people locally get those jobs. So if you think about how important we thought it was to win these back in 2017, now that they're upon us, it's even more important to us to make the most of these for local opportunities. The next big area of the plan, the third area, is doubling down on what was already going well. And this is really where we come back to the significance of the first section of the presentation. We are much more likely to be able to get new jobs in what was going well than think of something completely new. So the construction sector was actually the fastest growing part of our economy pre-pandemic. And so we're calling this out as another area of new growth. The image on the top left I love is from Wolverhampton, the new Centre for the Built Environment at the university. This will also be the brownfield site of something we're just about to break ground on, the National Centre for the National Centre for Brownfield Regeneration, a sort of new brains of a whole industry based here in the West Midlands. But the whole point is that it drives the construction sector. And then if we press on in this, one of the opportunities in construction is, of course, the town centre master plan. Brilliant that we've now got this plan come out with the council, with obviously the bid, some of the major employers, landowners in the town. And you just see there the aspiration that is behind that master plan. I mean, we all know Solihull Town Centre has been incredibly successful over the years, but even Solihull is not immune to the trends, and we are going to need to move on with a new master plan here, hence what we've been doing. But I wanted to pull out the jobs created on the back of this. And it's not just about Solihull Town Centre. Also, click on again. Of course, we have the plans for the regeneration of Kingshurst. We know an area of the borough, if you look at the boarded up units there, an area that really needs that investment too. And for good news across the West Midlands, if we go on, if you look at just at the last budget again last week, 4 of our areas, £100 million injected by the Chancellor, Raleigh, Regis, Smethwick, Wolverhampton and West Brom, £100 million for towns funds for those areas. So incredible reinvestment in some of our cities. The other area that, of course, was going well before we move away from construction is, of course, transport. And if you look at the cash that we're spending on transport now, it is 5 times per head of population what it was in the year before I was mayor. An incredible effort to draw in expenditure for transport. And each scheme, and we just had the announcement last week of the stations in Walsall, hence the picture of me standing at Willenhall with the leader of Walsall Council. We had the money for that, the money for the Camp Hill line. So 5 times, as I say, and every scheme is more jobs, obviously, in the short term. So we're doubling down on that. And of course, we're keeping an eye. You're getting telepathic as to when to advance now. Well done, Grace. Missing something in my intonation. We're also now very clear on our long-term transport plan, and that's the map that we are steadily colouring in. With every investment that we get, we colour that in. So there we go. On to the next piece then, please. And then we've got to think about our distinct strengths. The 4th part of the scheme, yes, concentrate on what was going well, but let's think about what's uniquely strong for us. And this is where the notion of an industrial strategy comes out. And of course, the areas just to pick out our strength in tech and digital. This is where most job vacancies are. If you look in the current job sites, LinkedIn sites across the West Midlands at the moment. So a real doubling down here. I chose the Rico image because that is now where we have our first 5G lounge, and this whole issue of digital really critical there. The next big area of success to build on is, of course, creative. This was perhaps the fastest growing area. And of course, I've pulled out the whole sort of image of what we're doing, Create Central, as we call it there, the wonderful creator of Peaky Blinders, Stephen Knight, who's going to be building his film studio there. And hopefully we will have some news next week. I will tantalize you about the BBC investment in the region as well. And I have to pay credit to Solihull College as well, because they are doing the boot camps for skills development with Create Central. So thank you to John and his team at the college for the work they are doing there. So that's creative. And then, of course, health and life sciences. If there's any industry that's booming after COVID, this is it. And the image you see there is, I think it's just mouth-watering this. This is the image of the Birmingham Life Sciences Park in Solihull. You see the QE hospital up on the hill. And this is now not again a fantasy. The diggers are in the ground, 200 million of private investment just announced at the end of last year. And the first building is being built with some public sector funding as well. 10,000 jobs is their target in this critical sector. And then let's move on. The 5th area, of course, is to make sure we build back better. So we've got our great strengths, but we've actually got to think, how are we going to do it differently as we build back better? And of course, this is where people want to think about net zero, getting to 0 carbon emissions by 2041. Our plan WM 2041, investment going in behind it. But the critical point here is it will provide jobs as we build out this new green economy. Of course, the big example here is the Gigafactory in Coventry, but there are other things as well, perhaps wee bit more immediately understandable. So let's go quickly to the next slide. So of course, what we're doing on our work around cycling routes, a couple of examples there actually from Birmingham, but you know, it's not just in Birmingham. great scheme just being developed in Solihull. If we go on to the next slide. Sorry, I forgot the order of the slides. My apologies, my apologies. All part of our overall network of cycling paths for the West Midlands, as we're calling it, the Starley network, building on what we've got, colouring in new, and some examples of colouring in new. Of course, in Solihull, next slide, the Meriden pathway that is now being funded for the safe route to Milson's Wood. So a lovely little local scheme. It's all part of this bigger network, obviously. And just bringing us right up to date with yesterday's news, launching the cycle hire scheme across the West Midlands. We launched or trialled for a month in Sutton Coldfield. That's the image just in the park, and then in the parade in Sutton. We launched formally in Wolverhampton yesterday, and it will very shortly be coming to Solihull. The bikes, by the way, made in Stratford-on-Avon by Pashley. So there'll be 1,500 bikes across the West Midlands rolled out by July, including in Solihull. And then, of course, the other aspect of building back better is all the green, the biodiversity. Here we are in Malvern Park, starting our planting of our virtual forest, 16,000 trees now planted. And anyone can plant one in their back garden and put it onto our virtual forest on our website. 16,000, great progress after we started in Solihull, literally just before COVID in the planting season last year. And full marks on the last slide in this little section to Solihull Council for their Wildlife Ways piece. Beautiful. Arrive at Solihull Station in the summer and you feel as though, frankly, you're in an alpine meadow rather than part of the West Midlands, and brilliant example of what can be done. And I was pleased that we were able to support that financially. So lots on building back better. And the last bit very quickly is, of course, what we're doing to retrain people. Those youngsters who fell out of work, we are going to need them to be retrained in apprenticeships. The image, and we've got our own unique levy scheme. So if you're a big employer, don't spend all your levy. Those big employers have come forward. We can actually spend it in small SMEs like the wonderful one I'm showing on the right-hand side there with young employed apprentices. And what we're also doing, if you're not apprentices, is of course doing our sector-specific retraining courses. This was just 2 weeks ago at Wolverhampton College, where we launched our program around electric vehicle maintenance. And there we are, those two young apprentices there, trainees, doing their program there. 720 jobs, a new industry. Moving on, of course, we've got our digital boot camps. Lovely way of getting retrained. About 80% of people who go on one of these get a good job afterwards. This is run by the School of Code. There's lots of other providers now. We've been literally pioneering on that. And of course, the big national scheme that's also coming for retraining, if we move on again, is of course Kickstart. Here we are at Tesco, who were the biggest regional user of Kickstart thus far, but hopefully many, many more to come on board. And of course, we've got to keep fighting, winning funding for the region from the government. Just a little summary there. That's how much money has come in, new funding from the government before and post-COVID to do all of these things. And by the way, I don't fall into the trap of thinking the government has to pay for everything. It's private business that pays for most of this. But as is a general theme in the presentation, public money can just unlock, can leverage private money. And that's what we've been trying to do. And obviously, as I say, onward, last slide, the biggest prize of all is, of course, the gigafactory that we've got to have for the electrification of our automotive industry. And we are now at a site in discussion with manufacturers and, of course, seeing JLR's incredible ambition over the electrification of their own industry. So the slide I'm going to leave up is that one, because I think the idea that there's more to come in this recovery plan is the one I want you to be left with. But I hope you also think there's some really practical stuff that we have genuinely started on. It's not all jam tomorrow, as politicians often talk about. There we are, Robert. That's all I wanted to say. And we have indeed got, I hope, plenty of time for questions.
Andy, thank you so much. A comprehensive appraisal of the situation. And I think we all do still believe that the 2020s can be the West Midlands decade, and particularly one for Solihull. So thank you very much for that. And we're going to hand over now to our very own question master, to Tony Elvin, who's going to run through some questions, and hopefully, Andy, you'll be able to give us some answers. Over to you, Tony.
I'll try.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you, Andy. Great presentation. Solihull Chamber members, this is your chance to put Andy Street on the rack here. You've got him exclusively for the next 30 minutes. I'd love to see your questions coming through. We're very lucky to have some questions that have been sent on in advance. So if you're trying to think of what that burning question is that you'd like to ask Andy, then please get that down in the Q&A box now. If you are struggling with that at all, then please feel free to use the chat box. But Andy, first of all, the hospitality sector brings so much to Solihull, not least the NEC, but also those corporate hotels in town. What can we do to make sure that, as we're allowed, we can encourage more of those face-to-face meetings and events, and for people to come back to Solihull for business tourism again?
Yeah, okay, great question. So I hope colleagues would agree that at least now we've got the roadmap, that's the start. But what we've got to do, I think, first of all, is we've got to see it actually being delivered on time, because there's nothing better than that to give confidence to someone running a business to think, yeah, I am really going to open on that day. So that's very slightly glib answer, but I do think it's really important. You can almost feel confidence gaining steadily, almost day by day. So that's very important. Second thing that was important was the government actually giving the financial support for hospitality. As I said, the grants that they will put it on the table, then the business rates, the VAT exemptions, and hopefully allowing long repayments of CBILS, because I'm well aware lots of hospitality businesses have taken a lot of debt. But then I think one thing we can do in the West Midlands, don't know quite how we're going to do it yet. There will need to be a sort of open for business campaign. We're going to need to work with all the councils as well on that, again, to get people used to going back to the venues, whether it be Resorts World or whether it be the city centre, to do that. And then the last bit, and I haven't achieved this yet, but I'm going to put my neck on the block because I think it's important. I want government to begin to think about guaranteeing certain really big events in the sort of live events sector. Because again, I think if they saw that government was utterly determined, I don't know, Wimbledon might be a brilliant example, not in our patch, but if they were utterly determined to make something happen, or they were utterly determined to make the British Grand Prix happen, or they were moving away from sport, they were utterly determined to make a big conference at the NEC happen in the 1st of September, it would just tell everybody that they really could plan with certainty. Because what I hear time after time, Tony, from business people is uncertainty is the real underminer. And that's why I want the government to do every single thing they can to convey a message of certainty.
Absolutely. And it really does feel different this time. There really is that hope. We were talking about it earlier, spoken in a few meetings today, and everyone's kind of feeling that it could be different this time, that we really are going to come out the other side. And that's, we've got to hope for that. I've got a question here from Fraser. Andy and Tony, any thoughts on how we can work together in the leisure hospitality industry to be more than just the sum of our parts? So how we can work together collectively to I guess drive business into this region?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, Fraser, and I haven't necessarily got a full answer to it. But I tell you, I'll be very honest, I'll tell you what I have thought about through the whole period. The hospitality industry, I don't think it's particularly well coordinated itself. If you take something, and I know it's a very different structured industry, but if you take something like automotive, they have the Society of Motor Manufacturers, aerospace have the Midland Aerospace Alliance, and on the list goes. Other sectors are better organized and coordinated, and you know one or two people you must deal with. Now, there are some brilliant leaders in hospitality, and actually if you take retail, by the way, obviously the big example is the British Retail Consortium, and then and locally there are the bids as well. So there's real structure. But if you take hospitality, brilliant leaders, and there was that wonderful video done, Hope for Hospitality, West Midlands business leaders, absolutely outstanding. But I don't think the sector is particularly well organized. So a subject that I've taken up with Neil Rami, actually, who leads the growth company, is how would we like to see this sector better organized, structured? Because I think, Fraser, you are onto something when you ask that question, that it isn't as easy as some of the other sectors to plan for, basically. So it's a very live issue, frankly. But part of the answer, of course, is this regional promotional campaign that we will do at some point. We don't know quite what the funding structure is going to be and all that. But I think there's an underlying point about representation, though, Tony.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to hear that you've already given that some thought and spoken to Neil about that.
Yeah.
Now, Andy, you've been complimentary about Solihull MBC, both publicly and privately to me. What is it that you find so positive about our local Solihull Council?
They do what they're supposed to do. That might sound so very simple, but actually, do the council services run in Solihull? Yes, they do.
Yeah.
I'll give you a really practical example that matters to your members. Councils across the country have just been given the responsibility for distributing the government's grants. And I sit here and I see the speed at which different councils get on with it. There is absolutely no question that Solihull has been the fastest in the country. Sorry, not the country, the fastest in the West Midlands and among the fastest in the country. They were also very imaginative in thinking of this £1,000 discretionary grant for hospitality, as I understand it. Might have the numbers wrong. So they do what they're supposed to do, but at the same time, they're also able to think big in terms of, you take the Arden Cross development and the way they're contributing to that. I mean, that is really a brilliant example of placemaking on a national scale. And Solihull isn't the biggest council in the country, but it is capable of thinking in that way. And I think that's so important.
Brilliant, thank you. Andy, got a question here from Pauline Clark. Andy, what are your thoughts on getting our airlines back up and running, generating more international business and domestic visitors?
Yeah, this is very important to the Solihull economy, isn't it? It was one of the other reasons why, the data was expected to be bad for us, the significance of the airport. Not as bad as Crawley and Gatwick and all that, but still a big hit for the borough with the airport. I don't know if people know there's 7,000 jobs at the airport directly and many, many more. So it matters, this does. So what do I think will happen? I actually think the short haul summer holiday flights, maybe not immediately in May and June, but I think when we get to the peak of the summer, they will probably bounce back fairly quickly, actually. That's what people like, what's his name, Michael O'Leary and the EasyJet and co were all saying, wasn't it? And I think that if it is deemed to be safe and permissible, I think actually there will be pent up demand for that. I think that will bounce back. By far the bigger issue for Birmingham Airport, though, is re-establishing the long haul flights. Now, some of them, like Delhi, will probably come back naturally anyway. But what we have got to do in this post-Brexit world is we've got to think about where are the long-haul destinations that we really need to, nurture. And the three priorities for me would be New York, Mumbai and Shanghai. Some of you might know I went to Shanghai with the airport back at the end of 19. We made a commercial proposal, but events, dear boy, overtook us. Mumbai, we think we can make a proposal to Air India. And of course, the airport team know they've got to sort out New York. And that will take time, skill, and putting it bluntly, probably a bit of subsidy to get those to be up and running. But I think it is absolutely critical that those three, probably the three world superpower economies of the future, that we are directly linked to them at Birmingham.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a question from an anonymous attendee here. What are the Mayor's views in supporting local security firms? Most of the buildings, such as job centres, universities, etc., including the upcoming investments he mentioned in construction and transportation, are hiring global brands like G4S. Can we have your views and how we as local businesses can improvise or get involved?
Yeah. You can have my view in principle on this. I actually didn't know what's just been said, and I'm slightly surprised by it actually, because it just sort of seems slightly illogical. I would have thought a local company would be able to have all sorts of advantages. So the principle here is that all these big investments that I talked about at the beginning, whether they be the Commonwealth Games or City of Culture or HS2, I've tried to make sure SMEs are have the opportunity to bid for contracts. Best example of what we did with HS2, where, as I said, in Bilston, we had a a Zoom event, because it had to be done virtually, 750 SMEs in front of the main procurement people from HS2, exactly what we should be doing. So I've put that type of thing together to get onto this. And also where we have direct control of the cash, we've always tried to encourage at least some SMEs onto the shortlisting as part of our social value policy in the WMCA. So I'm afraid that's all quite general policy stuff. I didn't know about this security piece. I'm obviously wondering where we are on Commonwealth Games with this, because that's a huge security piece. And I don't know what the thinking is about local companies' scale of doing that for this.
Well, I was going to say, I know this is an anonymous question, but the whoever's asked it may know me and may want to send me a private email, because I know the Chamber have done some work on how to best procure, be successful in local procurement with the games, with other local initiatives. So I'm sure there's some stuff that we can try and find out some more information on that as well.
And I'd be more than happy you ping that through to me, Tony, because I'm genuinely surprised and quite saddened by it, actually. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Steve Whitmarsh says, hi Andy, with the very exciting projects underway in the region, such as HS2, will there be any specific initiatives to provide access for local businesses to be involved? It's the same question, I guess, to be involved in that local supply chain. So yeah.
HS2, we definitely did it once, but we are going to repeat that because obviously the type of contracts that are needed have now moved on. So absolutely, categorically, we will do that again.
Super. Now, despite the West Midlands being one of the worst hit regions by the pandemic, announced regional investment projects to boost local economies have largely swerved the West Midlands so far. Yes. Is this because we're just about to announce the Gigafactory, or is it because of the investment already coming in via HS2?
So I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question. Okay. So I presume what people are talking about there is there wasn't a free port for the West Midlands. No, we didn't bid for one. The best free port location for the Midlands is East Midlands Airport, because that is actually the biggest freight airport in the Midlands by a long way. And it was obviously only ever going to be one for the Midlands. So you choose the battles that you are going to fight. Actually, I would have said that if you look at capital investments that have been made, obviously HS2 is the biggest of them all. The transport investments that I went through, those were announced by the Chancellor in his budget last week. We did pretty well on that. And of course, some of the private sector investments have also, like the Life Sciences Park, have also been made. So I'm struggling to see what whoever the question is thinks we've missed out on. Okay. Maybe the Freeport piece, actually.
And I think you've already said we should benefit from the East Midlands Freeport in any case, by being in the vicinity.
The simple fact is we did not bid for one. We want to build relationships with each of those, both the East Midlands and other coastal freeports as well.
Yeah. Now, Solihull as a borough enjoys prosperity.
Yes.
There are, however, contrasting fortunes in the north compared to the south. How can this be levelled up?
Yeah. The long-term way of levelling up anywhere, and it's why I started with this slide on this actually, is all about skills. That's the most important way. Because if you've got people of real talent, they will definitely secure a good job and then will move on their way. So that is why I firmly believe that that's the best, and there's lots of evidence of this, that is the best way of achieving this social mobility, the idea that someone can better themselves over time. And that's why what we are trying to do is make sure that all citizens, particularly young people, irrespective of, frankly, whether they live in North or South Solihull, have access to the training schemes. What we particularly tried to do, though, is make sure that some of our training interventions, we called it connecting communities, they apply particularly in the least advantaged areas. And I'll give you another really good example of this, where we're trying to tilt these things. If you look at our work on digital retraining, which, as I said, is an incredibly good way of achieving good jobs, we've actually actively tilted that towards women and members of ethnic minority communities, because there is no question there is less opportunity for them. So we are actively trying to do that. One other thought about north of the borough, and this is definitely for next term rather than this. If I look at the transport infrastructure in South Solihull, three brilliant railway lines, frankly. The main Solihull line, the line to International, and of course the Shirley line. It's pretty well connected. And I'm sure that has helped drive business over recent years. North Solihull is less well connected. So there's a particular commitment to build a railway station at Castle Bromwich. And what we're also going to have commitment in the manifesto to do is to have the metro extended through the east of Birmingham to North Solihull. And I was standing at Chelmsley Wood, middle of Chelmsley Wood, shopping centre just 2 weeks ago with Ian Courts, and I think there is an incredible regeneration opportunity there on the back of improved public transport. And if you think how sort of, what's the word, vast that space is, a 1960s design driven by my motor car, I can see a really, really green regeneration there that would actually densify what's happening, bring in new housing. I think it could be really exciting. So no commitment around that, but certainly there will be a commitment around the transport infrastructure.
Thank you, Andy. John Callahan's made a comment, construction gateway training with our partner, RMF, has continued throughout the pandemic and was a feature on the BBC News. We're training construction workers on plant and groundworks, and business is booming. The AEB flexible funding has made this possible. So long may it continue, as we're getting 90% of our completers into work, which is a fantastic story, isn't it?
Brilliant. And I didn't know John was going to be on the call, so you will be witness that I called out the excellence of Solihull College without even knowing he was going to be there. But John, thank you, because it's a brilliant example of exactly what I'm talking about. Giving that training gives a skill for life, and people can better themselves, and that is ultimately the way that we will deal with some of the endemic issues. And Solihull College has been brilliant in working with us with the funding that we have through the adult education budget. And other budgets, actually. Yeah.
Thank you. Steve Britton says we have to make Brexit work, and the Chamber of Commerce are doing a great job supporting industry in understanding the new procedures. More importantly, though, we need the West Midlands Mayor to work with central government to reintroduce the efficiency so critical to the automotive sector and their supply chain. And I'm also aware of, difficulties bringing alcohol into the UK as well, with the convoluted process that's now in place, and I'm sure if you look at any industry, there are some issues there.
Yeah.
Comment on that?
Yeah. Well, I'd comment that Steve is absolutely right. We had what's the best word for it? A pretty seamless operation of our just-in-time supply chains, and frankly, whether it was just in time for JLR or just in time for Marks and Spencers, it was exactly the same, and that has clearly been disrupted. So it's a very good day to be reminded of this, because I'm actually with Michael Gove this evening, and this is one of the things that has to be discussed. I know it's critical for businesses, and Steve is right, we've got to get back to how it was. And the way you do that, of course, is you pinpoint a particular problem and you get to the bottom of why it's occurring and then solve it. And that's the sort of conversation I'll be having with Michael Gove about how we're going to do that. And if there are particular examples, let's have them and feed them in, is clearly the point.
Now, Andy, you gave an example there. You're going to speak to Michael Gove to try and improve the situation. I think from anyone I speak to, Birmingham Solihull business community are very happy with the work that you're doing as the West Midlands Mayor. But there is a debate, maybe not with you directly, that people say, would we be better with a West Midlands Mayor that doesn't align with the government's politics? Or what are your thoughts? Are we better having an inside guy that's got the ear of the likes of Michael Gove, or are we better off with an Andy Burnham style Labour guy who's going to stand there on with a placard and say the government are doing us down and we need investment? What's your take on that argument? And I did say to Robert Elliot I'd keep that question anonymous.
Do you know what? I think it's a good question. And naturally, I've got a very clear view on it. I think the region is much better served by someone who can do business with the government. Now, let's be clear. There's no point being a lapdog of the government. I don't believe I've done that. If they're getting things wrong, I call them out on it, like when we went into tier 2 for hospitality and there was no business support on the table. I was straight on it. Rishi, you've not got this right. It was on the major 10 o'clock news at night. And it was a bit uncomfortable because some people in my party say, Andy, you shouldn't be doing that. But my answer is no, it was the right thing to do because the government are wrong. And of course, in 9 days later, Rishi Sunak stood up in Parliament and said Andy Street was right. He was vocal in his call, and we're actually going to change what we're doing. So sometimes you can influence the government to change their view by being part of their extended team. And bluntly put, I would ask you to think this, and I've actually said this to Andy Burnham directly. Do you actually think that he did any good for Greater Manchester by standing on the steps of Manchester Town Hall being deliberately obstructive? The answer is no. You've got to work with central government in a constructive way. And I think the evidence is that we have drawn in investment to this region by making those business cases to central government and getting them to invest. And actually, the slides I put on at the end about how much money's come in is sort of the evidence of that. So I'm very clear, be part of their team, but always a little distant to central government, because I do not agree with everything they do. So distance, but still being part of overall.
Thank you very much. Now, Keith Rozelle has asked, would the Mayor care to comment on International Women's Day? And then following on from that, women have been worst affected by COVID, source Government Equalities Office. What's your position on this?
Yes, I would very happily comment on International Women's Day. Brilliant events happened. If you want, I think it was Keith, wasn't it? If you want to have a look and be inspired by women, on Friday at 5 o'clock, we did a special event with about 14 inspiring women from across the West Midlands, all sorts of backgrounds, mature, young, all sorts of ethnicities, all sorts of businesses. And it was literally tear-jerking, some of the stories that were there about challenging adversity. That was the sort of pledge for this year. I choose to challenge, they all said. And it was inspiring. And it said to me, there are incredible people. And so my job was simply to draw attention to that. And I'm pleased I did. Now then, in terms of the wider piece, by the way, and if we want to go into other things we're trying to work on, obviously all the work around the Leadership Commission, looking at the gender pay gap, which has made progress in the West Midlands, by the way, which is encouraging. But the wider point about COVID having a bigger impact on women, that is definitely true. And of course, it is why, coming back to some of the things that John Callaghan was talking about, some of our focus in that retraining work is particularly for women. So the huge majority of that adult education budget that was, as John said, has flexible funding, 63% of that goes to women. We haven't perhaps made enough of that, but that is a clear example of how we're trying to tilt the resources we have to deal with those who don't have necessarily all the economic advantages.
Thank you, Andy. Now I've got a comment here from a very strong Solihull woman, Susie Ancret. She says, we are supporters of the Inclusive Leadership Pledge.
Yep.
And keen to see what the future plans are. Now more than ever, we need strong leadership.
That's absolutely true. And Susie, you won't have to wait long because we're going to relaunch the next phase of the Leadership Commission next week. And I'd have to shoot you if I told you what was going to be in it. But absolutely, definitely, you are right. The need for this is even greater than ever. So Anita and Kieran are coming back to the crease, not that in a sense they ever left. And we will relaunch that next week with another set of objectives.
Thank you. We've got a question from an anonymous attendee. Going back to hospitality, a real worry for us. How are we going to get people back out spending again in pubs and restaurants? Do we have a dish with Rish plan / initiative? Have you got anything like that up your sleeve, Andy?
I don't think we are. I mean, you know, time will tell, but I actually think it's going to happen. My read of it is, A, there's a lot of money in people's pockets if they've been lucky enough to keep their jobs. We all know that there's there's an influence, some haven't, but the huge majority of people, they've saved money and they want to go and spend it. We're also hugely social animals and we haven't been able to do that sociability. And I am convinced that it will come back. So I do not actually believe that we will need that increased subsidy this time. And the other reason, of course, people are going to feel, as Tony said about 10 minutes ago, people are going to feel much safer this time, particularly if they've had the vaccine. So if I'm wrong, we can always step in again. I'm sure the Chancellor would. But actually, if you want me to be a sort of predictor, a clairvoyant, I think the bounce back in those sectors once we get the reopening, and I know it's still a fair way to wait to the 21st of June, but I think it'd be pretty strong.
Yeah, and I'm already hearing some encouraging stories from some of my favourite restaurants that are fully booked on this date, fully booked on that date as well. I guess it's that longer term that we really need to keep people out and engaging. I imagine there's going to be, there is going to be some nervousness, but with the vaccination programme progressing so well, it's got to give us confidence, hasn't it? Jez Wallace asks, on a much lighter note, are the Villa ready for European football? Now, as a West Ham fan, I would say, I would jump in and say, I think they've probably got a season to wait, but be interested to know your opinion, Andy.
I thought so, but obviously that confidence is wobbling a little in the recent weeks. It doesn't look likely this. It looks it looks unlikely, if we're really honest, this season, doesn't it? Even though it was still, you know, could happen, it's still tantalizingly close. But in a sense, you know, that shouldn't worry us, because we have made enormous progress in 1 year, and it's a credit to a great local leader, of course, in Dean Smith, who's achieved that. And if it takes another year, then so be it, because we know of the best teams, they all have to be built steadily in that way. So I'm pretty amazed, by the way, about West Ham's performance this year. I was genuinely amazed. You wouldn't have got money on that at the beginning.
You wouldn't have got money from me on that, Andy, I have to say. But I think as a Villa fan or a West Ham fan, you've got to be delighted with this season. It makes a change to look up the table instead of down, doesn't it? So.
Exactly. For us to be ninth, as it is this, actually, yeah, we were still ninth this morning. That's right. Then that's obviously a huge piece of progress. So to be celebrated.
Yeah. Now, Pauline Clark says the pandemic, as awful as it has been, has engaged the local community again.
Yes.
Your thoughts, please, on promoting the health and well-being of our community, developing more green space, especially in the north of the Solihull. I know you touched on the centre there of Chelmsford Wood, and continuing on the ethos of looking out for your metaphorical neighbour.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. The green space bit, I'm absolutely categorically clear on. You know my whole commitment on brownfield development, the green belt protection, and there will be opportunities, as Solihull have already demonstrated, for further planting. You know, they've got this lovely idea of 250,000 trees in 10 years. Totally behind it, exactly the right thing to do. Brilliant. And as I say, our virtual forest shows some progress already. But in a sense, the more tricky part of the question is the first part, because of course it's right that communities have come together in a completely unprecedented way, and we've learned so much and admired it so much. But the difficult part of it is, how are we going to maintain that? So what I'm certainly thinking about, I'll say in the centre of the CA here, is there a sort of structural way we could do this actually? We're looking for, I'll give you a really good example. When we do our environmental project, environmental board paper that Ian Courts will be leading week on Friday, there's talk about community green grants for developing schemes that do, literally as it says on the tin, green communities. So we can do some practical things and use a little money to stimulate it. But I'm sort of thoughtful about a deeper point about how do we sort of weave all those community organisations that have done such a brilliant job somehow into the fabric of the place. And by the way, the CA shouldn't think it steps forward to answer that. I think every council, every local authority, every parliamentary constituency, everything should all be thinking about that actually, because it's such a lesson of COVID.
Thank you, Andy. Now, we're kind of time up really now with the questions, but I'm going to ask you one more before we hand back to Robert. So if I could get a quick answer from you on this. Regarding the CBILS offer of repayment up to 10 years, this is at the bank's discretion. Would it not be better so that businesses can plan for the longer term that the government make bank loans 10 years and not 6? And this is from Solihull legend Kevin from Prime Accounts.
Oh, yes. I think the answer to this is yes, actually, because the whole idea of this is that governments stand behind it. Or stand behind certainly the bounce back loans. So there is an inconsistency in this. And I'm sure this is what you're getting at in the question. The big issue for small businesses that I see is the debt mountain and the speed of paying back that debt that is going to prevent businesses investing. So the longer we can possibly take that repayment period for viable businesses, the better actually. And that's why in principle, I have huge sympathy for what you say. There is just one nagging doubt at the back of my mind, and you'll see the purist economist in me here, that we all know this, and it's a hard thing to say, but I will say it. There is no point in dragging out a business that is not going to succeed. It's actually excruciating for the people running it, and it's not a good use of money. But assuming that we're talking about businesses that can succeed, but just need help recovering from the situation, it is right that they should be given maximum amount of time to do it. But I just think we've got to be so careful that we don't end up continuing things that actually have passed their best.
Sure, absolutely. Andy, thank you so much. Thanks for being so candid with your answers. I'm going to hand back to Robert Elliot now. I should say at this point that wasn't Robert's question earlier.
I hate that.
I get in trouble, but Robert, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And I think the spot on Thursday nights on BBC One in the evenings is still safe there. But and thank you for trying to throw me under that electric powered bus. That's fantastic. Andy, I think you've probably noticed with some of the questions that certainly in Solihull there has always been and there will remain to be a spirit of working together, because working together we are getting things done. And it's with your support and with the organisations that you connect us with which helps us there. So thank you for that continued support, and thank you for your time this afternoon. I know your schedule is ridiculous at the moment, and it sounds as if that continues later today. But on behalf of everybody at Solihull Chamber of Commerce, all our members, all our partner organisations, it's a big thank you for you to joining us this afternoon. And we wish you good health and good luck with all your activities as you move forward in 2021.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you to all the participants and the questioners. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Stay safe. Bye-bye now.